Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video where you guys really seem to enjoy my reactions to the channel General Knowledge. They tend to do really well here on the channel. So we're going to take a look at another one. I was browsing through their videos, and this one looked really kind of cool to me, and I thought it would be an interesting thing to explore. It's kind of history. I think it'll be history because it's just really interesting maps you need to see. Guessing some geography in there too, but that all relates to history. So as always, a link is in the description to the original content if you want to check it out without my commentary. And we're going to I have no idea what to expect, what it's all about. But I want to give a big shout out to Riley in Menasha, Wisconsin, and Keegan is it Timaru in New Zealand. Thank you guys so much for your support on Patreon. Really appreciate it. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Maps are amazing. They show us the world and sometimes provide us with interesting information or statistics regarding the area which is represented. So in this video, I want to show you guys a few maps that I found really interesting, either because of when they were made, the way they look, or the data we get to learn from them. So here we go. First, the map on the thumbnail. This map gives us a comparative look at how land is used in the United States of America. Obviously, the area itself in terms of regions isn't accurate. It's just displayed this way, so we get an idea of how big they are in comparison to each other. I was really surprised by the gigantic amount of land that they have dedicated to cow pastures.
Listen, cows are amazing. Okay, they're my favorite animal. So that actually surprises me too a little bit. And I'm trying to decide, since he's narrating these maps, and we're going to be able to kind of look at them ourselves. I think the easiest way to do this might be to let him kind of talk through the map so we don't overlap it all on the commentary. So let me go ahead and let him finish talking about this one. And when he goes to the next map, then we'll stop and maybe make some observations of my own here.
It is a lot. I was also surprised by the amount of corporate timberland, which I imagine is the land where companies grow and cut trees to use/sell the wood. I was really surprised by how small, at least in comparison, the area dedicated to national and state parks is. It's crazy how golf fields take up more space in the US than do their plantations of maple syrup, although I guess it's more of a Canadian thing. But I mean, how many golf courts do you really need? And also, the 100 largest landowning families hold an amount of territory equivalent to the state of Florida. That is a lot. Speaking of America,
all right, so let's go ahead and take a look at this map for a second. I'll wait till he zooms back out.
Florida. That is
so the maple syrup thing doesn't surprise me, or the corn syrup thing doesn't surprise me either. And a lot of this is not necessarily indicative of what is consumed by the United States. It's probably partially that. But remember, the U.S. is going to be importing a lot of things. We're also going to be exporting a lot of things. So this is just what we're actually producing ourselves. And you can see here that basically New England and Pennsylvania and a little bit of Virginia basically make up all of the area that is housing. And of course, that probably also contains the land on which people own homes, right? So I grew up in a house in a small town, but we had 2 acres of land. So that 2 acres had one house, one family on it. But you know, most houses in the area where I live are more like a 1/4 acre of land each. But then you go out to Wyoming, and people are going to have like square miles of land for ranches. I love that he chose. Whoever made this map chose to make Michigan the part that was idle or fallow land. And of course, Ohio is where the food we eat is. But the cow thing does surprise me a little bit, just the amount of size that is involved. But when you think about how much beef is consumed just by Americans, it does not surprise me a whole lot. Another way to look at this that would really be interesting to me would be to look at the breakdown of actual land as it exists, because you would see wide swaths of land in some of the states like Nevada where huge chunks of land are owned by the government still. So the national parks and state parks, he said that was surprising to him, but honestly, that's a decent amount when you think about it, how big the U.S. is. And to put this in perspective, right? Because it's a map, so you don't necessarily get perspective. The cow pasture range, our cow land alone is several times over the size of the UK, for example. UK is going to be like, it would fit like right in kind of the area between Ohio and, say, Alabama and Mississippi there. So, interesting.
A lot. Speaking of America, I found another really amazing map about the north of America too. This is how the region looked like about 77 million years ago, consisting of around 4 major islands and the rest being ocean. In the background you can see the current continental lines. It's so weird to think how different our world looked a few million years ago. In this case, so much of it was submerged, although in a few cases, parts of the ocean were at the surface. Also, the Caribbean seems as if they were dislocated to the south, but maybe those islands have nothing to do with our current Caribbean, and it's just a coincidence that they are there. The yellow squares on the map represent sites where dinosaur fossils were found. Speaking of
and yeah, that's an interesting thing to note, is that we don't really find the remnants of dinosaurs everywhere. And really the finding of dinosaurs is really only the last couple hundred years. I saw someone commented one time that George Washington did not know that dinosaurs existed. That's absolutely true, because we hadn't found evidence of it yet. So imagine what we will find evidence of in the next couple hundred years that we didn't know existed today, that our great-great-great-great-grandchildren are going to find out about. Pretty fascinating stuff. But one of the other things that I've heard that was really cool is that if you're familiar with the idea of Pangea, which is that all of the continents at some point were united and kind of up against each other, then you realize that the Appalachian Mountains right here are the same mountain range that runs through the Highlands of Scotland, which I think is epic and really cool, because where I live is right kind of in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains.
Squares on the map represent sites where dinosaur fossils were found. Speaking of places where certain species are found, here is a map of the global distribution of flamingos.
Can I just appreciate the fact that we're using pink for that on the map? Yeah, I didn't actually know that flamingos were native to the United States at all. I guess just southern Florida.
This surprised me for 2 reasons. One, how big the range of flamingos is, and the fact that they are found on the majority of Earth's continents, which is weird because they are places with very different climates.
Yeah.
But another surprise was the lack of flamingos in certain areas.
They obviously like coastland, because, I mean, look at where they are. Cuba, and then down here to looks like, I guess that's Dominican Republic and Haiti, Yucatan Peninsula and Mexico, and then you've got northern South America, and then southern and western South America. You've got South Africa over here. Yeah, Spain, going up right up to the edge of France there. Cool.
Sure, there's some logical explanation, but it seems kind of weird that a species that is present in so many places wouldn't be present in more. I mean, why are they present in almost all of South America except Colombia and Brazil? And why is the little bit of Africa the only part of the eastern coastline that doesn't serve as home to the magnificent animals? Also, why does Nepal have flamingos according to this map? And why does Australia and almost all of East Asia not have any? The next map is about empires. Whenever we talk about history's big empires, usually 2 of them come up: the Romans and the Mongols.
Yeah.
With arguments over how the Mongol Empire was bigger, but the Romans had a more organized system of administration, and so their effective rule over the land was bigger, amongst other discussions. In this map, we can see the 2 empires side by side. Now, if you don't know, it's important to note that they did not coexist at all. They are just present in the same map here, so that it's easier for us to compare them. The Mongol Empire is definitely bigger.
Kind of cool thing about this map is you see the areas that were under both, right? There are certain, like eastern Turkey, good chunk of modern day Iran, I guess Romania over here in Moldova, areas that were Roman Empire and were Mongol Empire. That's pretty cool.
so that it's easier for us to compare them. The Mongol Empire is definitely bigger, there's no doubt about that, but I do agree to some extent that the Roman Empire is more impressive. Maybe it's just European bias, I'll admit that, but I do feel like a good amount of the Mongol Empire was just empty land and deserts, while the Romans subjugated entire civilizations. But then again, the Mongols conquered China, so it doesn't really get more impressive than that.
That's true.
It's also cool to see how they overlapped in some of their controlled territory, making it so that these regions in blue and red stripes have a really interesting history of being able to say they were part of
I didn't know he was going to go back to that map, or I would have let him finish talking about it.
two of the greatest and most significant empires in history. This next map is the most interesting one for me. It shows us the educational background of world leaders for each country and overall. Now, the colors used for each of the areas isn't very optimized, if you will, because some of them are too similar to get a clear idea when you look at the map. Politics and economics is the most common education area for world leaders, with 41 countries, followed by law at 35. I was surprised.
And I'm guessing he's talking about current world leaders, right? But here's the thing. I don't know when this map was made. Let's go ahead and take a look and see. It was 3 years ago. Okay, so theoretically, I guess then we're talking about when Donald Trump was president of the United States, because now it will be law, right? And I think by and large, most American presidents in history have had a law background. That's been their degree, at least, even if they ended up going into something else first.
Surprised by a few of these. One of them is number 3 at military. I know historically a lot of leaders have been military figures, but in modern times I was surprised that this is still the case, with the majority of those being in Africa. One that's surprisingly low is public policy and administration, with only 7 worldwide, although counting with a pretty big one, France. Keep in mind,
and like I said a minute ago, you're probably dealing with people who have more than one of these backgrounds. Obviously, if you think of someone, that maybe was in the military, but then they get elected as governor or something, and then they become a president. Are they politics background? Are they military background? I guess I'd be curious to know what their basis is for this. I'd love to see a map where it considered more than one for each person to see what are the most common things that people have experience in, because you could have experience. George W. Bush, for example, had a little bit of military experience. It wasn't, he wasn't in combat or anything, but was in an Air Force Reserve. He has political experience as the governor of a state. He also had business experience as the owner of a baseball team and involved in oil companies. So where do you put that, right? So
this data is from 2018, so some cases might have changed already. Maths is also kind of low, with only 10 world leaders having a numbers background, but also counting with a major country, Germany. And then arts and humanities is, although surprisingly, thankfully high up at number 4. Also, remember that I have no idea if this map, or any of them for that matter, are fully accurate. In this case, they don't really explain if they're analyzing leaders in terms of head of state or head of government. So in the UK, for instance,
in the United States is one of the rare countries where our head of state is our head of government. They're the exact same thing, right? Many countries have, including most Western countries, have separate president and prime minister, or a monarch and a prime minister, things like that. So it varies from country to country.
The Prime Minister or the Queen. Back to a map about the US. This one isn't about leaders, but the population itself. This map shows us the largest ancestry groups in the US by county, also giving us a general idea of states and the US as a whole. Now again, to whoever makes these maps, choose colors that are different. Why is French and Japanese almost the same tone of yellow? But moving on from that, I was pretty surprised at some of the results. I had no idea that so much of the US population had German ancestry. It seems to be the most common in number of counties, although less people live in these areas, so it's not the biggest ancestry group in terms of real numbers.
I will say this, that's true in the West. That's not true in places like northern and central Ohio, right? So other than Cleveland, of course, you got Cuyahoga County there, which is more African-American than anything else. But, Trumbull County is where I grew up. I live in Mahoning County, which is right here. Combined, you're talking about like 700,000 people in those two counties. You've got Allegheny County, which is Pittsburgh. You've got the area in here real close to Philadelphia, those suburbs around Philly, the areas around Baltimore and Washington. These are some pretty high population areas. Northern Indiana's got some high population areas. So Buffalo, New York, same thing. So that's true in some ways, but not true in others. And the other thing we need to observe here about American ancestry is very few Americans, unless you're like a first or second generation American, very few Americans are pure-blooded anything. We are mutts. We are a little bit of everything, right? My ancestry is primarily British Isles, probably 2/3 of it, but I've got healthy doses of German, Swedish, little tiny bit of French in there as well. And I think probably that's true for most Americans.
English comes next, followed by African Americans and Mexicans. I was also surprised by a few others, the amount of Scandinavians up north, the fact that there are still significant Native American populated counties, especially in Oklahoma, and some Inuit people in Alaska as well. And we should also note the Italian and Irish majorities in the northeast coast around New York, Boston, etc. But like I said, these represent the number of counties where each ancestry group has the majority. They don't represent which ancestry group has the most people.
So a couple other things about that. Boston was the primary port. Boston, and then of course New York, but New York was the primary port for everybody, immigrants coming in. A lot of Irish immigrants came in through Boston, which is why you ended up with like the Kennedys in the Boston area, right? The Fitzgeralds and others. That's a really common place for Irish ancestry because of all of that. Scandinavian ancestry is very common up north. Oklahoma, why the Native American ancestry? Well, that one's simple. Oklahoma was called Indian Territory. The Trail of Tears in the early 19th century, when you have a lot of these folks like the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Chickasaw and others that are living in this area, they get sent to what is now Oklahoma. And so you have many of those reservations to this day are there.
Group has the majority. They don't represent which ancestry group has the most people, because the US have a very odd population distribution. This map shows us exactly that, with the same amount of people living in the orange areas as in the red. Both east and west coastlines have as much people as over half the territory. This is even more radical in some other places, like Australia for instance, where in this map we see that only 2% of the country's population lives in the yellow area. That is really cool.
And that's true about Canada as well. I don't know if you'll show that, but most of Canada's population lives within, probably 40 or 50 miles of the US border.
Those lacks of balance when it comes to population over the territory sometimes lead to arguments of how the land should be reorganized in certain countries, especially having to do with political representation. But speaking of land reorganization, here is a map of the US, but with a slightly different division. These are the 20 air traffic control zones of the US, which are not at all similar to their state lines. Florida alone has 2, for instance, but the Salt Lake Zone controls almost 5 different states. Speaking of different land organization, in 1992, a man called Freddie Heineken proposed a map depicting what could be, in his view, a viable United States of Europe, consisting of 74 federalist states. But it's interesting how some countries would remain whole. Portugal, for instance, Greece and Hungary, while others would be very much divided.
So that gives you a great indication. If we're talking about even population, it gives you an indication of where the people are, right? And how all of Portugal is equal to this little sliver of London and then northeast of London, for example, or the greater Paris area, right there, or the area around Berlin. Spain, not nearly as highly populated as I would have expected it to be. So that's all really, really fascinating stuff. This is what's cool about maps.
Like Spain, Italy, France, or Germany. Also, this division here of Serbia, Albania, and Montenegro would not cause any trouble at all. This next one is one I'm pretty sure I've already shown in previous videos, but I always keep coming back to it because it's just fascinating to me. This is our world, but upside down. The fact that we map our continents the way that we do is just conventional to my understanding. So what if we decided that north was down and south was up? It's weird how the exact same land looks entirely different, and our perspective of it changes as well. Another fantastic one is also one I previously showed in part, but now have in full, and it's this one. A map or graph, if you will, which shows us the continent of America and the countries that are along the same latitude lines. It's very weird to see how different...
And I find it interesting. You'll notice something he said there. He said the continent of America. Referring to North and South America as one continent. And believe it or not, while I've never personally heard that until recently, I have seen that there are places where it's viewed that way, that not everybody has the traditional view of there being 7 continents: North and South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, Antarctica. Other people break it down differently, and a lot of people see this all as one continent. But what's interesting to me in all of this is how much further north, for example, the UK is than where I am in Ohio. Because I think of Portugal and Spain as having like warm climates. Like I think of them comparative to Florida in terms of how their climates are. But Portugal and Spain are actually in line with where I live in Ohio, which I tend to think of as being a more wintry, cold, rainy place. So it just goes to show you that how far north or south you are is not the only factor in what makes weather the way that it is.
Different countries with somewhat different climates coexist along the same latitudes. For instance,
that's cool.
It's weird for me that Portugal is at the same latitude as New York and Japan, or that the UK is up there with Canada, that Namibia goes along to Australia, or that Cameroon are on the same lines as Indonesia. And finally, this map of Africa, which shows us the locations of giraffes and the distribution of the different types of patterns that they have. First of all, I had no idea that giraffes have different patterns according to their subspecies or something, but it's also cool to see how they vary according to region. And those are a few maps I found interesting.
That was actually really, really fascinating, and I enjoyed that a lot. And if you have other types of videos like this that you'd like me to check out, I would love to see them. Just let me know in the comment section below. Let me know your suggestions. I always take suggestions, whether you're a patron or a member or not. I welcome and I read every comment. So give a shout out to Joshua in South Bend, Indiana, and Steve in Louisville, Kentucky. Thank you guys so much for your support on Patreon. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.